Howdy, y'all. Welcome to True Lying Film Discussion. Because films lie to tell the truth, or some truth, or a truth. Ain't that something?
Today we are going to look at, let's say, the meat on the bone of 28 years later. And I'm joined by a new friend today, a Scottish person, much like the director Danny Boyle, or should we say Danny Boyle. But before we focus on the film itself, I would like to ask you to say a few words about the franchise as a whole, because I know how invested you are in it, and it's a franchise that has fascinated you over the years. So I want to know, why is that?
Okay, yeah. So the thing with the 28 days, weeks, and years later, well, what is the franchise now? It was actually the first film that I ever watched. Maybe I was 15 or 16 years old, and it was the first film that actually I watched it to appreciate it rather than just to be entertained, you know? Prior to that film, I think it was like Gladiator and, 300 in the cinema. And I was like, wow, everything's so cool and amazing, like colorful action. But then 28 days later just blew my mind when I was 15. The style and the texture of it was something totally different to what I was used to. And I began to appreciate films more because of that film. And that's why I've rewatched it so many times since then. And why it means so much to me. And then obviously you had 28 weeks later. That one was also, great film. It's got our boy Robert Carlyle, who's a legend. And then many years later again, 28 years later, even though the film 28 years later is so different, it still retained that unique kind of texture, which is raw, real, and very British.
I remember when 28 Days Later was released, and it was an important film for everyone who is of our age. And I remember very clearly that it had a very strong effect on me. It felt like a very serious, deep, intellectual, but also horrific, fun horror film. How many times do you think you've seen the original 28 Days Later?
It'll be at least 5 times. Every now and again, I'll go back to that film. There's something kind of comforting and peaceful about it, and it comes down to this kind of eco horror idea as well. Like sometimes it's nice to fantasize about a society which has been destroyed, and there's the potential for a kind of refreshing of the world. And when he wakes up in the hospital, I feel kind of jealous of him. He's got a fresh start, and he's got the world is his oyster almost, despite all the crazy, fast running zombies running around.
A horrific palate cleanser of sorts.
Yeah.
Well, it is interesting to ask why we watch horror films sometimes, and I guess we are excited to imagine our own catastrophe and how we would cope. But if you had to describe 28 years later in 3 words, what 3 words would you use, and very briefly, why?
Ooh, interesting question. I'll probably go for, okay, so colorful, because the cinematography, for some reason, it was like when I saw it in the cinema, it felt like the film was bulging out of the screen. I don't know what they did. I don't know if this whole iPhone rig, 28 iPhones later, I don't know if it was that, but the color was just popping, and I was in the cinema. Honestly, it was quite an experience watching that. Can I use 2 words? Like, not scary. It wasn't a scary film in the way that 28 Days Later was. It kind of lost a certain piece of its texture, I think, but it gained other elements. Bringing on to the third word, which is adventurous. A very adventurous type of film. A lot of stuff to do with personal development and coming of age type stuff.
The 3 words that I would use would be surprising, bonkers, and subversive. Surprising because there is an ecological sense to the film of continuity, and I was pleasantly surprised, that they took the future idea of what the ecological situation might look like seriously. Bonkers in a mostly positive way, because a lot of the film felt to me a little bit like a Jackson Pollock painting. There are a lot of elements thrown at the canvas. Some shapes or some ideas emerge more clearly defined than others. And then subversive because I think it tries to tangle with some political analogies. My reading of the film, I would say that there is something ineffective about its attempt to subvert and its attempt to say something about the political. But I am open to changing my mind about this over the course of our discussion, if you are able to change my mind about that.
Yeah, I think the subversion in the film is, for me, it's kind of like a take it or leave it. You can pick up little bits here and there. I think you're better at picking up these kind of things than me. I tend to kind of just ignore it usually. But no, I know there's certain things, especially like the very obvious like EU good, Britain bad.
For now, let's move on to eco horror as a genre. Can you think of any eco horror films?
Eco horror films. No, you give me some. Give me some examples. Refresh my memory.
I'll give you an easy one. Dinosaurs, Turn the Light Off, Sam Neill.
Jurassic Park.
Indeed, yeah. So Jurassic Park, I would say is a classic eco horror film. And another one would be Dawn of the Dead. Another one is a film that you quite admire. Soylent Green is People.
Yeah. I was thinking about Soylent Green. Sometimes I blur the line between horror and thriller and science fiction because nothing scares me anymore. I used to watch horror to be scared, and nothing scares me anymore.
These lines do blur. These genre lines are not absolutely sealed and watertight. A film like The Day the Earth Stood Still, I would say a horror film, but most people just call it a science fiction thriller. Whatever the case, to me, that is a critique of the idea of nuclear proliferation and nuclear threat. And what I'm getting at here is that the eco-horror genre is always a vehicle for some type of social critique. Jurassic Park, obviously, it is critiquing human arrogance on some level in almost a Frankensteinian way of humanity playing God. Soylent Green would be a critique of our consumption habits. Dawn of the Dead is a critique of consumerism. Night of the Living Dead is a critique of, I guess you could say, people afraid of the civil rights movement. So that film has a lot to do with race. The Australian film Long Weekend, again, like Jurassic Park, is about human arrogance. And 28 years later, definitely has its own critiques. I feel there's more than one critique embedded within 28 years later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you said, kind of an experiment where they're throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks.
You can watch the film and just enjoy the ride, but there's watching and then there's watching. If a film is inviting you to make certain political connections and certain real world connections, then it is inviting you to watch it in a certain way. So if we were to watch Night of the Living Dead by George Romero, yeah, we can watch that film and we can totally ignore the fact that one of the characters is a black character and just, I guess, enjoy the film. But we're not really watching the film in the way we're meant to. It's important in that film that the character is black, and it's important what happens to him. And it's the same with Dawn of the Dead. It's important that we see the film as some type of critique of consumerism. It's important that a lot of that action happens in a supermarket, in a mall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But before we get onto the critique that the film advances, I wanted to focus a bit on the actual ecological stuff happening in 28 years later.
I think something that's interested me with this film is the evolution of the zombies, or the infected, sorry. I don't know, I refuse to call them zombies. Obviously, this film's introduced the alpha zombie, the alpha infected, the pregnant infected. We also see the zombies, okay, I'm just going to call them zombies, eating like fish and normal food and kind of forming little communities and almost like gangs, tribes. And I think they're trying to make a point about these infected becoming something more than just mindless rage virus kind of zombies that are bloodthirsty and kill without even thinking about it, And I'm not sure what Danny Boyle is thinking with that, or what the writers are thinking, or what kind of point they're trying to make,
Yeah, that is what I was pleasantly surprised by, was that type of ecological continuity. It didn't just drop us back into the very first film. Actually, things have changed the way they do in real ecological systems. It kind of goes back to Jurassic Park. The famous quote from Jurassic Park is that life finds a way. And in 28 years later, we have these new evolved forms of the infected, which are dotted all over this English landscape, like megafauna, like the so-called alphas. And we see this strange blending of the relationship between this flora and fauna in this post-apocalyptic landscape. It made me think that this was similar to post-disaster regions in the real world, like Fukushima or Chernobyl, where we have actually discovered that life inexplicably just goes on and finds unexpected ways to grow and develop, and often quite novel ways to grow and develop.
And there's an interesting thing as well, the symbiosis with the survivors and the infected. There seems to be something going on there. So with Dr. Kelson, he seems to have found some way to coexist with within that system, that new ecosystem. Even seems to be kind of friends with one of the alphas in a way. It's quite interesting.
Mm. It introduces this new or emergent system of ecology. It also takes seriously the idea that with a new ecology, with this new situation, with life finding a new way, it stands to reason that people would find a new way to live within this ecology too. This is where the film, I think, starts to invite us to critique the new ways of living.
So we have the Holy Island community. They live a kind of communal lifestyle. So they all work together. Everybody's making sacrifices there for the community as a whole.
It's undeniable to me that the system of government that they've developed there is some form of autarky. So there's some type of, you said communal living, but there's also this somewhat quasi-fascistic emphasis on one's role in the society. We see the way that the children are educated. We get a very brief glimpse of this. In the school, there are these posters about different roles that the children can assume to help the community. The watchtower person, or the farmer, or a fisherman, or whatever. It feels to me like the film is trying to advance some type of critique about this. But on the other hand, the demands of the actual story, so the reality of the story, suggests that this is actually a very reasonable way to systematically and politically respond to a crisis.
Yeah, I think for that kind of society to function at all, then I think having those kind of strict rules and roles in a community are going to be absolutely essential for it to function. And I think it would be the same for us if we suffered some kind of societal collapse. I would immediately gravitate towards some kind of role to help the community function and flourish, you know?
It seems reasonable to me that this would be an appropriate form of governance. But the film has been made in the wake of the COVID outbreak. It's also been made in the wake of the Brexit decision in the UK. This stuff has baggage in the film. When we see the English flag, not the British flag, the St. George's flag, flying above the Holy Island Mission mini island commune, this is a symbol that has teeth in the film, right? It's not some type of innocent symbol.
Oh no, definitely not. It's very clearly England, and then Scotland is obviously quite an important part of the of the film as well, which is revealed later.
We have a new ecology in the world of the story, and accompanying this new ecology is this new way of living. And this new way of living has very clear nationalistic kind of iconography for the viewer.
Some scenes from an old film, I don't recognize the film, where there's, these guys firing off arrows, very English scenes as well, very, like, say, nationalistic. And I think the longbow is the kind of weapon of choice of these Holy Island community members. And there's, I think I'll just mention it now. I noticed something at the end of the film which really struck me, and it was hilarious. It was when Jimmy jumps down. No, before he jumps down, sorry. And he says, hold, hold, fucking go. Right? He says that. And do you know what film that is a reference to?
I didn't pick that up as anything significant, but tell me.
Braveheart.
Oh, really?
Yep. Yep. There's a scene in Braveheart where Mel Gibson or William Wallace says, hold, hold, and then now to kill the English.
There are a lot of these little things. Some of them are more overt than others, but they all make up this, I would say, undeniably deliberate menu of British iconography. So on the Holy Island mission, we can see that the community has a portrait of the Queen. We obviously see that they're flying the St. George's flag, not the British flag. You mentioned the longbows from the film footage. Obviously, we also have the Kipling poem Boots.
Yep.
Is there anything else that I'm missing?
The accents are very strong, really strong accents.
Are they regionally important accents?
They're very much northern accents, northern English accents. I think it's only Dr. Kelson maybe who has a more of a southern sounding accent, which is interesting. But obviously in England, there's that north-south divide is quite a very important distinction for sort of cultural identity.
Everything from Hamlet all the way to the Teletubbies is referenced in this film.
Yeah.
This has something to do with the film and with Alex Garland and Danny Boyle embracing their Britishness. And that's cool. But a big part of the story is that Spike is going through a masculine ritual. So it's a coming of age story. And part of this sacred rite that he has to perform is going with the father from Holy Island mission to the broader island, what is formerly the United Kingdom. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then it's at that point he starts to get these indications that, yes, the world is bigger than he imagined, and there's this whole other world out there, and the world is so much bigger than my isolated little England, right?
Mhm.
And then this sense is reinforced when we meet the European character. When we meet Eric, the Swede, there's something about his demeanor that he's kind of looking down on the mother and Spike. And he sees them as being regressive in a way, that they're these isolated, potentially even inbred people from this little England community that just hasn't been able to adopt what broader Europe has adopted in order to survive and thrive through this pandemic.
Yeah, so it's like a critique of the isolationist Britain. Britain is a kind of backwards and, yeah, like you say, regressive.
Yeah, I feel like the film wants to advance some type of critique as it relates to Britain's response to the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, for sure. I think there is another one, which is the various father figures. They all have different attitudes to the infected, right? So Dr. Kelson is he says that everybody's a human, they're all humans, all these skulls saw with their eyes and spoke with this jaw or whatever. But his father and Jimmy are both very much dehumanize the infected. So his father just says, aye, kill him. You don't have to think twice about it. And I'm sure Jimmy feels the same way. And I think that you could probably relate that back through to how different people reacted to COVID, how some people were a bit more compassionate and understanding and potentially followed the science type thing in Britain. And then some people were more reactionary and, didn't want to conform to the various government regulations. It could be a bit of a stretch I'm making here, but I think there's something in that.
There's definitely something in that, something peculiar actually that you've touched upon, because the Doctor, played by Ray Fiennes, he is meant to be the most noble of the father figures, at least so far. And he has this somewhat dark mysticism about him, and he embraces death as this ever-present reality of life. He emphasizes the importance of the memento mori and so on and so forth. So it's interesting to me that he seems to be being propped up as the wisest of those father figures.
Yeah.
Because it's maybe not what we would expect. We would maybe expect to hear that the wisest father figure during a pandemic is the one that tries to save everyone. But in this story, it's actually the death embracer.
Yeah, and he's probably the most interesting character in the film, to be honest. Dr. Carlson, he's a very striking moment when he meets him. Do you think he is using iodine? Iodine? Just a side question.
He says that he's covering himself with iodine.
Yeah. Could it be infected blood?
I guess it could be. I had no reason to not believe him, though.
I didn't trust him, and he told me that for some reason.
But I do think that was a cool detail, and I do think it was actually iodine that he was using to cover himself. He's taken on the iodine-stained skin of a doctor in lieu of the lab coat, which is now unavailable to him.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Now, the other thing is I don't know which one is more contentious these days, the COVID thing or the Brexit thing. But I think it sets up this tension between what we can call oikophobia and a type of Pan-Europeanism. And when I say oikophobia, I'm not talking about pigs. And when I say Pan-Europeanism, I'm not talking about pizza. Do you know what I mean by these terms?
Oika what?
Oikophobia, which is the opposite of xenophobia.
Okay, right. So that's like a kind of self-deprecation of your own people?
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. So, which family do you want to belong to? Do you want to be just an Englishman on your little island, or do you want to be a European on the mainland? Do you want to be a biscuit tin nationalist, or do you want to be a pan-European cosmopolitan individual?
Do you think they tried to portray it with the Swedish guy with his demeanor and the way he acted and talked?
100%.
Yeah.
Of course, this tension is introduced right at the start of the film, where it's made clear to us, written for us, Europe has moved on and has left the UK behind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we don't get much more information, and I feel like that doesn't really work as a critique of Little England syndrome, because surely then the implication is that Britain has been left behind by Europe at large. That doesn't really lock into the idea of voluntarily removing oneself from Europe at large. Do you hear what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think a lot of people, when they critique Brexit, they often forget that it was actually a decision made by the people, and they kind of take this moral high ground. And I'm guessing now, based on what we're talking about and based on that film, that Danny Boyle probably doesn't support the UK leaving the European Union.
It would seriously surprise me if he was some type of British nativist.
Mm-mm.
I kind of expect these days that most of the cinema we consume will be coming from a certain ideological position anyway.
Yeah.
But does the critique have staying power? And as it relates to the actual story, I feel like it ties itself in a bit of a knot because we're dealing with a few elements here that cause the analogy to seriously suffer. So what I would argue is that in order for a film to have a strong analogy, like a strong metaphor, the allegory has to be like a belt. The belt has to keep the trousers of the story up. If the allegory doesn't fit, the trousers fall down, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the civil rights allegory in Night of the Living Dead, which I mentioned earlier, that allegory really works. Now, what I'm arguing is that the one in 28 years later, it just doesn't quite lock with the story. And upon closer inspection, it doesn't really even make sense.
Yeah, I would say the trousers are probably tight enough without the belt. Just to further your analogy there, which I like that. That's a great analogy. Yeah, I think it's a bit half-baked. Like I said, unnecessary and initially does fit in with the premise. You know, like I said, the quarantined island, but then it becomes a bit tired and half-baked. And I don't know whether I like the Britain of 28 years later. You know, I quite like it. I think it looks cool. So
well, it's a new and dynamic and vitalist way of living, away from endless spreadsheets, away from endless call centers, away from Turkish barbershops, there is something to be said about this new ecology that the film introduces.
Yeah, definitely.
So, if we were to do away with all of the heavy subtext and narrow down into the film as an ecological disaster movie, which is where I think it's at its most fun and at
Yeah.
its strongest, what does it bring to the table that makes it unique in the genre of the eco horror?
No, that's a really good question. 28 Days Later was a journey of personal development for Jim back in 2002. He's kind of like he wakes up in the hospital and he was a delivery boy. He's a bit glaikit, lanky, doesn't really know what's going on. He's got like a stupid haircut. And by the end of the film, he is like taking on a whole squadron of squaddies up in Manchester. And I think 28 years later is like another even more obvious version of that story in which the protagonist goes through a personal development, becomes more skilled, and fights for something.
There's almost like an Arthurian journey happening here with our character Spike, because now we are settled in to the new ecology of this new post-apocalyptic world. So now we have the potential for this new man to emerge. So
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
the character, Cillian Murphy's character from 28 Days Later, yes, he undergoes the transformation you've described. And it's an interesting one, and it's quite a violent and brutal transformation that takes him to the very edge where humanity and pure animalism reside uncomfortably close to one another. But
Yeah.
in 28 years later, we have this almost mystical quest that this kid is going on. I'm half expecting to see magic. I'm half expecting him to encounter a wizard or a Cheshire cat or even a Teletubby. Do you know what I mean?
That would be amazing. Yeah.
It would be, yeah. So I think they're definitely making this a more interesting coming of age tale with a lot of weird, mystical new ecology elements occurring along the way.
Yeah, yeah.
So the film is doing a lot intertextually. So what that means is that it's referencing a lot of other things, from the
Mm.
music of Wagner to Shakespeare's Hamlet to the Rudyard Kipling poem Boots to Teletubbies to the biblical figure of Samson and so on.
Mm.
So you pick one.
Teletubbies.
Okay. So people
I
probably
mean,
don't know this about you, but you have a freakishly large amount of Teletubbies knowledge.
yeah, not as much as I should have. I've lost some of it over the years since the pub quiz. But yeah, I was very happy to see the Teletubbies featured in the beginning of the film. And obviously they represented kind of consumerism, media overconsumption. They were like a virus, weren't they? The Teletubbies themselves. They were like the 90s summed up for children. If you were a 90s kid, the Teletubbies were the kind of symbol of what it was to exist at that time in that particular culture. And I think I mentioned at the start about color. I thought the film was very colorful. And now that I think about it, actually, it's almost like that first Teletubby scene in the film when it opens is kind of carried through the whole film, that color palette. It feels like it's there. It persists, you know?
I absolutely agree, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I made a note about that while I was watching the film. I try not to make notes while I'm watching something, but it really compelled me to just write down a quick note, which is that this shocking green that we see throughout the film, it's so bright. It's this bright, verdant green, and it sets up this visual leitmotif in the film that looks like the hills and the horizon line in the Teletubbies.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're right there. You're onto something.
The Teletubbies is meant to be this type of inverted, strange Garden of Eden. Because let's
Yeah,
think
yeah.
about the Teletubbies, about the show. What is actually going on in the Teletubbies? Is it or is it not like the Garden of Eden?
Yeah, you've got innocent creatures living together in harmony.
and there is some type of invisible caretaker of the garden, some type of omnipotent god figure. In the Teletubbies, I think people would be tempted to say it's the baby sun, the sun with a baby face, but it's actually the voice. Isn't there this type of all-powerful voice that occasionally occurs over
Yeah.
the landscape,
The
right?
periscope comes up now and again and speaks to the Teletubbies.
Right. So it is set up like the Garden of Eden.
Yeah. And how do you think that reflects onto the world of 28 years later of Britain as this kind of verdant, well, it's like what we said before, kind of like a reset.
Yes, it's a new ecology. It's a new garden. It's this new opportunity to have a new garden. So it's a type of inverted garden in the same way that the Teletubbies would be. You know, instead of Adam and Eve, we have Tinky Winky, Lala, and Poe.
Don't forget Dipsy.
And Dipsy, yes. Who could forget Dipsy except me? I think the reason why that visual leitmotif is so strong is because the film wants us to see the new flora and fauna. So by the megafauna here, I'm talking about the infected who roam the landscape. These are new inhabitants of a new type of garden.
Yeah.
So there's actually this strange ecological promise of opportunity for something new. And this was a very unexpected piece of subtext for me while I was watching the film. I didn't expect them to toe that line. It's not actually all just catastrophe. Yes, these are very hostile entities, but they are conferred some type of personhood as well. We have, let's say, the mega alpha infected, Samson, is given a name. He is an animal who has been named. They are even being named as types. These are alphas. These are the new type of infected. They're roaming around in some form of infected days, but they are inhabitants of this strange, new, inverted garden world that visually very deliberately resembles verdant green hills of the Teletubbies.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that before until you mentioned it, but it's absolutely true. And obviously later we have the birth of the not infected baby from the infected mother. What did you think about that?
The miracle birth. I think it adds to what we've just been discussing, this potentiality of the new. Maybe people just having to reconcile themselves with the fact that after disaster, something new and unexpected can emerge. Perhaps the future dwellers or co-dwellers of this space will be this strange progeny, miracle progeny potentially, of the Samson infected.
Yeah.
The iodine-coated doctor names the most threatening of the alpha-infected Samson. And Samson is a figure that we should all know from the Bible, but I think most people have forgotten to read their Bibles these days. Oh, Lord. But Samson, Samson is the strong man in the Bible, seized by the Spirit and by God and given powers by God, the powers of immense strength, for example. So again, we have this corollary with a new type of man or a new type of species that is developing that could potentially not just compete with, but overtake the existing inhabitants of the place. So we have a type of BC and a type of AD happening here too. We have the people before the viral outbreak, and we have this new type after the viral outbreak, roaming around, starting to come to consciousness in a strange way in this new garden.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a scene where at the end when Spike's running away and he's cooking a fish, one of the infected chasing him and stopping to grab a mouthful of the fish.
Yeah.
And it's showing that they're now becoming more, I guess, more human again in some way, somehow. And I think that it's kind of been set up as almost like a moral question, like hypothetically, what would be our duty towards the infected if this was to happen? And morally, how bad are they? Are they bad? Are they as bad as people? Are they worse? I mean, they're infected by a virus. They're not responsible for anything they do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's getting set up as a kind of battleground between these different groups who obviously are going to all have different ideas about how to proceed in the new ecology.
Mm-hmm. One thing I did want to mention was the connection to Shakespeare's Hamlet. I don't know if you picked up
Okay,
on this.
this is your realm here, Shakespeare.
Okay, it's not
What did you see?
quite it's not quite as deep as you might imagine. It's interesting though, and there might be more to this than I've discovered. But when the doctor, the iodine-coated doctor, shows the Swede's skull, he says, "Alas, poor Eric." Do you remember that scene?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay. Now, obviously, we all read Hamlet at school, didn't we? I did.
yeah.
Okay, that's fine. But you're probably aware of the line, "Alas, poor Yorick," right?
Yeah, that rings a bell, definitely.
Okay. This is a very obvious and not hard to recognize reference to Hamlet. And it's when Hamlet picks up the skull of Yorick. And I just want to read this passage from the play. So Hamlet picks up the skull and he says, "Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred in my imagination it is. My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed, I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar?" Now, the interesting thing here is that it relates quite nicely to the iodine-coated doctor's call for our young protagonist to face up with death, to accept the memento mori. And he's using Hamlet as a, I guess, cheeky reference point, even, that he knows the boy won't understand. So this reference point is more for the viewer than it is for the boy. The other interesting thing that I discovered, and I did not know this before, I had to look this up. The etymological root of the name Yorick is actually Eric, which is the name of the Swedish character in the film.
Wow, okay, interesting.
What this tells me is that these are very deliberate intertextual points that the film is making. There's no way that that is a mistake. That's a deep cut. That's some deep Hamlet knowledge that either Alex Garland or Danny Boyle or both have under their belt there. And the other reason I felt it was significant is because Hamlet is a type of case study in an existential journey of growing up, of manhood. The boy needs to become a man in some way. The father has died. Should he achieve vengeance? Should he even go on living? And so on and so forth. This type of journey that Shakespeare establishes in Hamlet, I think, is also meant to be mirrored in the journey of our protagonist in 28 years later.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I think also that the whole idea of father-son or parent and child relationships are really important for Boyle when he's making any film. 28 days later, we see Jim visiting his parents' house to check their, well, he knows probably they're going to be dead, but he gets there. We find that he was actually really very much loved by his parents. They had a picture of him with a little note written on it, on their lying dead in their bed in the house, you know? And I think this idea of our protagonists being quite well brought up or having good role models is always present in the films.
Mm-hmm. I look forward to having another discussion with you when the next installment comes out. I believe there will be 2 more installments, and it'll be interesting
Yeah,
to chat about those and to kind of reflect back on what we've said now, how much of what we've said maybe we feel vindicated by, and how much maybe we've missed.